Buried Echoes in New York City. Chapter 1, A Quiet Month. Detective Miles Harrington stood in the living room of his Astoria apartment, studying the flickering overhead light he'd joked about with Irene only a few weeks ago. He still hadn't convinced the landlord to fix it, but after the chaos of the DeLuca trial, a defective light hardly registered as a priority. 2 months had passed since the conviction. For the first time in a long while, Harrington had enjoyed a lull, a chance to breathe. He'd spent some of that time helping his father settle into a steadier routine. The old man, still using a cane instead of the walker now, seemed determined not to surrender to infirmity. His progress was slow but sure. Each week, Harrington witnessed a bit more resolve in his father's eyes, a glimmer of the cop he once was. Irene, too, was making an effort. She visited Harrington's apartment occasionally, teasing him about how barren it looked, just like old times, minus a decade of distance. The three of them even managed a few casual dinners where the past drinking troubles went unmentioned. Tension lingered in the air, but so did a sense of unspoken forgiveness. One sunny morning, Harrington decided to treat himself to a rare day off. He walked along the East River promenade, letting the crisp breeze clear his mind. New York's skyline gleamed across the water, skyscrapers catching the late autumn sun. He was thankful for a slow spell at the precinct. No pressing homicide, no urgent kidnappings, just the usual background hum of minor crimes that never slept in the city. He thought of his mother as he sipped a coffee from a street vendor. She'd passed away years ago, succumbing to a short, brutal illness, just when Harrington was starting to find his footing in the NYPD. She was the family's quiet pillar, never letting them see how deeply his father's drinking pained her. And yet she'd remained steadfast, believing in second chances. He could almost hear her voice telling him to take in the moment and rest while he could. By evening he was back at home, reading an old detective novel, an indulgence he rarely allowed himself. The hum of city traffic provided an odd sort of comfort. Then, just as the fictional gumshoe was about to corner a suspect, Harrington's phone lit up with a buzz. "Hey, Miles," Irene said, her tone cautious. "Dad's complaining of chest pains. He won't go to the hospital without you." Detective Miles Harrington found himself once again at the small urgent care clinic in East Harlem, pacing in the waiting area as twilight began to settle over the city. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a sterile glow, contrasting with the warm hues of the early evening sky peeking through the front window. Irene sat nearby, hands wrapped around a paper cup of vending machine tea. Finally, their father emerged from an exam room, cane in hand, wearing a sheepish expression. "Doc says I'm fine," he announced. "Could be a pulled muscle or stress. Sorry for the scare." Harrington exhaled, relieved. "No need to apologize. Let's get you home." They stepped onto the sidewalk, the air cool and tinged with the smell of damp pavement. Rush hour traffic still clogged the streets. Irene offered to drive their father, leaving Harrington free to head back to his Astoria apartment. As he walked them to the car, he noticed how the last streaks of sunlight gave way to deepening shadows. "Dad, take it easy," Irene said softly. "If you feel anything again, call us." Norman Harrington merely nodded. "Don't worry, and Miles, you get some rest too. You've done enough worrying for one night." Harrington offered a faint smile as he closed the car door. The city was alive with its evening pulse, restaurants filling up, headlights slicing through the dusk, a chorus of car horns blending with the low hum of conversation. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to hope that the night might remain quiet. But as he crossed the street to hail a cab, his phone buzzed. Lieutenant Gomez. He braced himself before answering. Her tone was clipped. "Harrington, we've got a possible homicide in Midtown. It's messy. I need you there ASAP." He glanced at his watch. It was just past 7 in the evening. The thought of diving into a fresh murder scene when he'd barely caught his breath made him clench his jaw. Still, he couldn't ignore the call. "Understood, Lieutenant. I'm on my way." Harrington signaled for a taxi. The driver nodded when he gave the Midtown address. As the cab pulled away from the curb, he stared at the neon reflections dancing on the wet streets. So much for winding down. The city, as always, had other plans. Chapter 2. A Grim Discovery. Harrington arrived at the Midtown office building under a blanket of deepening night. Streetlights glowed against the glass facades, and inside the lobby's marble entryway, harsh fluorescent beams illuminated the grim scene. Beyond the cordon of police tape, a single body lay slumped against a polished column. The clock in the lobby read 8:15 p.m., far from the usual hours for such a meeting, but New York never truly slept. Lieutenant Gomez stood near the reception desk, her expression etched with grim focus. "Victim's name is Grayson Wolfe," she informed Harrington as he slipped on latex gloves. "CFO of a major real estate development firm. Janitor found him a half-hour ago." The overhead lights hummed, clashing with the hush of the near-deserted building. Harrington crouched by the body, noting the victim's expensive suit, the bullet hole in his chest. A glossy briefcase lay spilled open, contracts and papers fanned across the polished floor. "He was shot recently," Harrington murmured. "No sign of a struggle, but let's see if forensics finds a casing." A security guard hovered nearby, wringing his cap. "I heard a loud crack, echoed in the lobby, then nothing. When I got here, he was already." His voice trailed off, eyes fixed on the spreading pool of blood. Harrington stood, eyeing the building's high-tech security cameras that lined the ceiling. "Any footage?" Gomez shook her head. "Systems down. Sabotaged, possibly. We'll keep digging, but so far no luck. Check with the building's security team for details, though. Maybe someone saw something off camera." Harrington nodded, taking in the sleek lines of the lobby, the deserted reception desk, the cold gleam of marble floors, the flicker of neon lights from outside catching on shards of broken glass near the chandelier above. The entire scene felt eerily sterile, as if the building itself wanted to deny any wrongdoing took place. He interviewed a few last-minute stragglers, an executive who'd stayed late, a cleaning staff member, a frustrated security technician attempting to reboot the cameras. None offered a clear lead. Most simply gawked at the body, whispering about how unexpected it was for Wolfe to be here this late. By 9 p.m., Harrington found himself in a small side office scanning security logs. Irene texted, likely wondering how their father was doing, but he barely acknowledged the phone. His focus was on the partial visitor list from the evening. No suspicious names, just a handful of employees and a couple of clients, none matching the approximate time of the murder. Detective Nick Albright poked his head in. "Miles, I've got a tip that Wolfe had an ongoing feud with another exec in the company. Martin Chess. Could be something." Harrington set down the logs. "Thanks, I'll follow up." He took a moment to rub his eyes, fatigue settling in. It struck him how drastically the day had shifted, from worried son at an urgent care clinic to lead detective at a high-profile crime scene. He pictured his father hobbling around his apartment and still being anxious about his own health. And Irene, would she be able to sleep, or would she lie awake too? He shook off the concern for now. Work first, he reminded himself. Family second. It was an old, uneasy habit, but tonight he had no choice. Murder didn't wait for personal obligations. An hour later, Harrington stepped outside for fresh air. Midtown glowed under the swirl of headlights and neon signs, the city as vibrant by night as it was by day. Rain threatened, a cold drizzle speckling his coat. He watched people rushing by, unaware a major homicide investigation had begun just steps away. His phone rang again. "Lieutenant Gomez. We need you to talk to Wolfe's colleagues first thing in the morning, but keep digging tonight if you can. We need answers, fast." Harrington gazed up at the office tower, lights burning in half the windows. Something told him this case ran deeper than a corporate spat. Real estate in Manhattan always carried secrets, old grudges, hidden ties. Slipping his phone into his pocket, he walked back into the building. It was going to be a long evening. He paused in the lobby, letting the reality sink in. Grayson Wolfe was dead, and the city demanded justice. Switching on a flashlight to examine the dark corners of the lobby, Harrington steeled himself. The night was young, and the questions had only begun. Chapter 3: Family Traces. By the time Detective Miles Harrington finally left the Midtown office building, the clock in the lobby showed just past 11:30 p.m. The crime scene still buzzed with activity. Uniformed officers interviewing potential witnesses, forensics cataloguing scattered evidence. Yet Harrington had gathered all he could for the night. His eyes felt gritty from hours under fluorescent lights, but the city outside remained ablaze with neon signs and passing headlights. He stepped onto the sidewalk, phone in hand. Messages flashed, one from Irene. "Call me when you can." And another from Nick Albright, confirming a few new leads to follow up in the morning. The crisp evening air carried an edge of winter chill, as if reminding him that rest would be scarce any time soon. He tapped Irene's number. She answered quickly, voice hushed. "Dad's been asking about you. He insisted I call. Says he found something related to an old case." Harrington frowned. "At this hour?" "Trust me, he's not letting it go," Irene said, exhaling softly. "He seems anxious." Harrington mulled it over. Part of him longed for a few hours of sleep, but an uneasy feeling gnawed at him. His father's newfound enthusiasm for old notes was equal parts encouraging and worrisome, especially with the man's health still in recovery. "I'll be there soon," he finally said. The taxi ride from Midtown to East Harlem felt shorter than usual, traffic thinning out under the late-night glow. Soon he stood at his father's apartment door, the hallway dimly lit and silent, except for the hum of a distant television from another unit. Irene greeted him with a tired smile. Inside, Norman Harrington hunched over the small kitchen table, cane resting against a chair. An open folder lay among old newspaper clippings and a notepad, the pages yellowed by time. He glanced up, relief and urgency mingling in his lined face. "You're here," he said, as if he hadn't entirely believed Harrington would come. Miles shrugged off his coat. It sounded important. He took in the battered folder and the headlines visible from across the table. "Is this about Edward Wolfe Sr. again?" Norman nodded, tapping the papers. "I did some digging into my old files. 30 years ago he was involved in a witness situation, pulled out of testifying at the last second. Could be nothing, but I can't stop thinking about it." Irene hovered near the counter, arms folded. "He's been at this for hours. I tried telling him he should be resting." Norman gave an affectionate but dismissive wave. "I'm fine, Miles. If you're dealing with Grayson Wolfe's murder, and if there's a tie to his father's activities, this might matter." Harrington grabbed a chair, ignoring the dull ache in his back. He reached for the folder, spotting names, addresses, and scrawled notes. "Okay, let's see it." As the three of them pored over the faded clippings, the apartment's overhead light cast sharp shadows on the table. Outside, the city's pulse throbbed. Horns blaring, sirens echoing, restaurants still alive with late-night crowds. Harrington couldn't shake the sense that this new case was about more than a corporate dispute. Perhaps it ran as deep as the old secrets Norman had once tried to unearth. Eventually he leaned back, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I appreciate this, Dad, I do. But you need to take care of yourself." Norman's gaze flickered with pride and regret. "I plan to, just don't shut me out, not this time." Harrington glanced at Irene, who offered a small, encouraging nod. The clock was past midnight. Another long night, another layer of mystery. With the Wolfe murder fresh and these decades-old clues surfacing, he suspected sleep would be the first casualty in his pursuit of the truth. And yet, beneath the weight of exhaustion, a spark of determination stirred. If uncovering old lies could prevent new tragedies, he would see it through, even if it meant confronting the ghosts that haunted both his city and his family. Before leaving, Miles paused by Irene. "Thanks for calling. Everything else okay?" She offered a half-smile. "We're fine, just Dad seems restless. He keeps talking about Mom lately, too." Her gaze dropped. "I think he regrets how much she had to shoulder. She was the glue, you know." Miles nodded, his own voice soft. "She was. I still miss her every day." They said their goodbyes. As Miles stepped back into the winter air, he recalled how his mother would tuck him in at night, whispering that tomorrow could always be better if you let it. Even when Norman came home late, reeking of alcohol, she never wavered in showing them love. He forced himself to focus on the present. The mention of Wolf's father, plus the old notes about shady real estate, stirred something in his detective mind. Could Grayson Wolf's murder be part of a broader tapestry woven decades ago? The next morning, he dug into archived police files on the Vance murder. Sure enough, Edward Wolf Sr. was listed as a key witness, someone who conveniently retracted his testimony at the last minute, leaving the case unsolved. Miles's stomach tightened. The same last name, the same real estate ties. Coincidence seemed unlikely. Yet the day offered no grand revelations. Lieutenant Gomez listened to Harrington's theory, but urged him to keep his focus on the present murder. "We can't chase every ghost from the past," she warned. But Harrington couldn't shake the feeling that the old case might shine a light on the new one. That evening, as he left the precinct, he dialed his father's number. Norman picked up quickly. "You find anything?" Miles hesitated, glancing at the swirl of pedestrians around him. "Not sure yet, but your hunch might be worth pursuing. Just don't overexert yourself." A soft laugh came through the line. "I'm your father, Miles. Worrying is my job." Miles hung up with a faint smile. Despite years of estrangement, they were forging a new rapport, one built on mutual respect rather than quiet resentment. He passed a newsstand with headlines screaming about the Wolf murder. The city wanted answers, and Miles would find them, no matter how deep he had to dig into the past to uncover the truth. Chapter 4: Threads of the Past. A chilly rain drummed against the precinct's windows the next morning, creating a steady background rhythm as Miles Harrington spread out the Wolf files across his desk. Photos of Grayson Wolf's body lay beside copies of property contracts. Threaded among them were Norman Harrington's faded notes on Edward Wolf Sr., an odd patchwork of old and new mysteries. Detective Nick Albright stopped by with a styrofoam cup of coffee in each hand. "Figured you might need a refill." He set one down. "Any breakthroughs?" Miles rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Nothing concrete, but there's a historical thread I can't ignore. Grayson's father was tied to a big homicide that never got solved. If Grayson was meddling in something connected to that era, it might have gotten him killed." Albright whistled low. "That's a big stretch, but I've seen stranger." A knock on the desk diverted their attention. A uniformed officer handed Miles a slip of paper. "You asked us to keep an ear out for any unusual chatter. Someone mentioned seeing a suspicious figure around Wolf's office building the night of the murder. Tall man wearing a black hoodie, possibly carrying a gun." Miles thanked him. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. Rain-slick streets made Manhattan traffic crawl, but eventually Miles arrived at Wolf's office building. He tracked down the night janitor, who confirmed a fleeting glimpse of a hooded man exiting the stairwell minutes before the body was discovered. The janitor's description was vague. Medium build, no facial details, but it was better than nothing. Later that day, Miles touched base with Irene, who was working at her nonprofit's downtown office. Over a rushed lunch in a cafe, she asked, "Find anything about Dad's old notes?" Miles shook his head. "Just that Edward Wolf Sr. likely lied under oath back then, but I need a stronger link to the present murder." Irene sipped her tea. Mom always told me secrets have a way of surfacing. She said your father's drinking was partly his way of burying guilt he felt over not solving certain cases. She believed every unsolved case left a mark on him. Miles's chest tightened. He could picture his mother comforting a troubled Norman, trying to keep the household afloat. I wonder if that's why Dad is so fixated on this. Maybe he sees a shot at redemption. Irene reached across the small table, giving Miles's hand a squeeze. You'll figure it out, and if it helps heal old wounds, all the better. That night, Harrington pored over real estate records linked to Wolfe Sr. and the Vance murder. It was a labyrinth of shell companies and old addresses. Around midnight, he stumbled upon a note in city archives. A purchase by Wolfe Holdings dated only 2 weeks before the Vance killing, then quickly transferred to another name. The property in question was a derelict warehouse near the East River, since demolished. A faint memory surfaced. Harrington recalled a conversation with his mother long ago about how some criminals hide things in plain sight. She'd been addressing a different topic, but the principle remained. If Wolfe Sr. had orchestrated something shady back then, maybe Grayson stumbled onto that legacy of corruption, and it got him killed. By the time dawn broke, Harrington had enough to suspect that Grayson's murder wasn't just about corporate rivalries in the present. It tied back to decisions made decades ago, decisions that might involve someone determined to silence the Wolfe family's secrets for good. He left the precinct with bloodshot eyes, not sure whether to crash for a few hours or head straight to his father's place for more background. A text from Irene sealed the choice. Dad wants to see you. Says he has another folder. Urgent. Harrington sighed, rubbing the stiff muscles in his neck. The city was waking up, its hustle building to a roar, but for him the night's work wasn't done. He flagged a cab, mind-juggling mother-father unsolved murders, and a new homicide that carried echoes of the past. All the while he wondered, would solving this case bring peace to his father? Or only dredge up more ghosts? Chapter 5. Fractured Memories. The squeak of old hinges announced Miles Harrington's arrival in his father's apartment. Norman sat at the kitchen table, Kane propped beside him, a folder open in front of him. Irene hovered by the sink, clearly worried. Miles noticed the dark circles under his father's eyes. Couldn't sleep, Norman muttered, offering a wan smile. Kept thinking about that old Vance murder. I dug up more clippings from my personal stash. Miles sat opposite him, glancing at the yellowed newspaper articles. You're sure this is helpful? Norman nodded, though his voice held a tremor. Edward Wolfe Sr. was rumored to have associates in organized crime. The Vance murder might have been a hit to silence him. Nobody knew for sure. If Grayson found any proof of his father's real dealings, that could be motive for someone else to kill Grayson. It's not just corporate rivalry. It's cleaning up old business. Irene joined them, placing a cup of tea by Norman's elbow. Dad, you need to pace yourself, she said softly. Mom wouldn't want you running yourself into the ground. The mention of their mother brought a quiet hush to the room. After a moment, Norman looked at Miles, eyes misty. Your mother was the best of us. She put up with my drinking, tried to hold our family together, even when I came home bitter and angry because I couldn't crack a case. She believed that the truth mattered more than our pride. Miles swallowed a lump in his throat. She was strong, he agreed, recalling the nights she'd tuck them in and whisper that their father was a good man, just trapped by his own burdens. Silence settled until Norman cleared his throat. Enough about the past. These notes might help your case. Take them. Miles scanned the clippings, his detective instincts buzzing. One article mentioned an eyewitness who vanished, someone who claimed to see Edward Wolfe Sr. meeting with a known mob affiliate. The deeper he looked, the more connections formed like a tangled web. Could Grayson have uncovered that link? Before leaving, Miles gently squeezed his father's shoulder in thanks. Irene walked him to the door. "He seems more haunted than usual," she whispered. "He wants closure, for me, for himself." Miles paused. "I just hope it's not at the expense of his health." Outside, the winter chill bit at his cheeks. The city pressed in from all sides, taxis blaring, pedestrians rushing. He hailed a cab to the address of the defunct warehouse site near the East River, determined to see if any trace of its history remained. The once industrial block had given way to sleek condos, but a fenced-off lot still stood vacant, a relic of aborted construction. Miles flashed his badge at a security guard, who eyed him warily. Inside he found nothing but rubble, twisted rebar, and half-buried metal plates that might have once been part of the warehouse foundation. He crouched by a chunk of concrete, noticing a faint inscription, W.H. Could it be Wolf Holdings, or a coincidence? Snapping a photo, he decided to have forensics analyze the site's records. Back at the precinct, he nearly collided with Lieutenant Gomez, who handed him a new piece of evidence, a partial surveillance recording from a building adjacent to Wolf's office. It showed a hooded figure entering the alley 2 minutes before the murder. The figure's stride seemed confident, but nothing else was distinct. No clear face or build. Still, it confirmed someone was there. That evening, Miles returned home, dropping onto his threadbare couch. He stared at the flickering overhead light. In his exhaustion, it felt like a metaphor for the case. Flickering glimpses, half-truths, no stable answers. He thought of his mother again, and how she'd always told him to trust his instincts but never lose sight of the people who mattered. His phone buzzed. A text from his father. "Stay safe, son. Let me know if you need more info." Miles smiled sadly. His father was trying in his own way to make amends for the lost years. If there was any silver lining to this tangled murder case, it might be the renewed bond forging between them. He set his phone aside and closed his eyes, letting a wave of weariness wash over him. Tomorrow he'd chase leads. Tonight he'd let the city's hum lull him into a dreamless sleep, one in which he hoped old hurts might finally begin to heal. Chapter 6. Shadows of Influence. A light rain spattered against Harrington's windshield as he maneuvered through midtown traffic the next morning. His destination, the Manhattan offices of Archon Investments, a company rumored to have partnered with Wolf's firm on high-value real estate deals. If there was a financial trail linking Wolf to his father's old associates, Archon might be the missing link. Inside Archon's sleek lobby, he found a woman at reception who informed him that the CEO, Lydia Harlan, was busy. With a flash of his badge and a firm tone, Harrington secured a brief meeting. Harlan's office overlooked the spire of the Empire State Building, a power view for a power broker. She greeted him with a polite but distant smile. "We're deeply saddened by Mr. Wolf's passing," Harlan said, gesturing for Harrington to sit. "But I assure you, Detective, Archon had no conflict with him. Our partnership was profitable for both sides." Harrington studied her poised composure. "You worked on several deals with Wolf recently. Any hint of trouble or outside influences?" She leaned forward, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on her desk. "I won't deny there were rumors about Grayson's father. Old mob connections, messy finances. But that was decades ago. Grayson was very forward-thinking, more interested in expansions than dredging up the past." His instincts prickled. "So you never heard him mention anything about his father's dealings or old secrets?" Her expression chilled. "I run a legitimate business, Detective. If Grayson was tangled in something, it didn't touch Archon." Leaving Archon Investments, Harrington felt more certain that the past was indeed seeping into the present. Whether Harlan was complicit or merely cautious, she confirmed the swirl of rumors about Edward Wolf Sr. hadn't fully died away. He spent the afternoon poring over newly obtained financials from Wolf's laptop, courtesy of the tech forensics team. Large wire transfers popped up, recent ones suspiciously coded as development fees. They traced to an account under a shell corporation, ironically named Legacy Growth LLC. Someone, it seemed, was funneling money to keep certain secrets under wraps. Evening approached, and Harrington glanced at the clock. He made a quick decision, calling his father. "Dad, I've got some financial leads that might tie into Wolf Sr.'s network. Mind if I swing by to talk through them?" Norman's voice held a note of surprise and gratitude. "Sure, son, I'll brew some coffee." When Harrington arrived, he found the old man at the table, Kane leaning against a chair, a scatter of old newspapers forming a makeshift timeline. Irene was absent, likely working late. They pored over the details together like two detectives on a case, something Harrington had never imagined doing with his father. "This shell corporation, Legacy Growth LLC," Harrington explained, "was set up just a year ago, but it's moved a significant amount of money. If Grayson was about to expose it, that might have gotten him killed." Norman tapped a headline from the Vance murder era. Wolf Sr. and his cronies used layering strategies to hide illegal funds. This is a modern spin on the same tactic. A flicker of excitement lit Norman's eyes. For a moment, Harrington glimpsed the dedicated officer his father once was, before addiction and regret derailed him. But the moment passed, and Norman's shoulders sagged. "I wish your mother was here to see this," he said softly. "She was my rock. Always believed we could come back from our darkest mistakes." Harrington swallowed. "I miss her every day, and I think she'd be proud of how far you've come." Norman turned away, but not before Harrington caught the shine of tears. Feeling he'd intruded on a private grief, Harrington cleared his throat. "I'll check on these accounts further. Thanks for your help." As he left, a swirl of emotions coiled in his chest: love for a father who was finally trying, sorrow for a mother who never saw them reconcile, determination to solve a murder that now felt like part of a bigger puzzle. The city lights outside beckoned, full of secrets, and Harrington knew he was one step closer to unraveling them, even as the past bled into the present, refusing to be silenced. Chapter 7. Closing the Loop. Days blurred into a pattern of interviews, paperwork, and tense waiting. Harrington pieced together a fragile timeline of Grayson Wolf's final weeks. He'd been investigating some of his father's old properties, possibly sniffing out financial improprieties. Then he abruptly stopped. Someone must have pressured him, or worse. Lieutenant Gomez summoned Harrington to her office. "We traced that shell corporation, Legacy Growth. It's linked to a consortium of real estate moguls. Guess who's on the board? Martin Chess." The news hit like a gut punch. Chess had claimed innocence, but if he was funneling money through Legacy Growth, he had motive to silence Wolf. Harrington left the office, adrenaline buzzing. He dialed Nick Albright, coordinating a discreet approach to Chess. Later, in a near-empty cafe near City Hall, Harrington confronted Chess with the evidence. Chess's composure cracked, his normally placid features contorted. "Grayson found out we were using old mob-linked funds to back some developments," he admitted through clenched teeth. "I tried to reason with him, but he threatened to expose everything." Harrington's voice hardened. "So you killed him?" Chess's eyes flickered with panic. "No, I only threatened him, but I swear I didn't pull the trigger." He ran a shaky hand through his hair. "There's someone else, someone bigger pulling the strings." Before Harrington could press further, Chess bolted, his gaze wild. Harrington gave chase, but a crowd of tourists blocked his path. By the time he pushed through, Chess had vanished into the chaos of midday traffic. That evening, Harrington retreated to his apartment. He needed to think. Irene stopped by with groceries unannounced, though he couldn't recall ever giving her a spare key. She found him slumped on the couch, reading old notes. "Rough day?" she asked, placing a bag of produce on the table. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Chess is in the wind, and we still don't have a smoking gun. just a trail of suspicious accounts and half-confessions. Irene approached tentatively. "Maybe you need a break. You look exhausted." He forced a faint smile. Wouldn't be the first time I've heard that. Looking at her, he remembered how their mother once predicted that Irene would be the calm one, balancing out Harrington's intensity. Perhaps that was her role now, helping him navigate the line between obsession and self-preservation. They talked quietly, reminiscing about small things. Childhood trips to the zoo, how their mother would always pack peanut butter sandwiches and sing old tunes. Slowly, Harrington felt the weight on his shoulders ease, if only slightly. Once Irene left, he found himself thinking about the bigger picture. If Chess was just a cog, who was the real mastermind? Could Lydia Harlan or someone else at Archon be pulling the strings? Or was it an as-yet unseen player with deeper ties to the Wolf legacy? A message from Nick Albright interrupted his thoughts. "We got a hit on Chess's license plate near the old Docklands. You want in?" Harrington grabbed his coat. Sleep could wait. If Chess was hiding near the docks, this might be the break they needed. As he stepped into the brisk night, he silently thanked his mother for instilling in him a relentlessness tempered by compassion qualities that might finally bring justice for Grayson Wolfe, and some measure of closure for the long-dead Vance case. The city's hum resonated in his bones, a living reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always had a way of surfacing. Chapter 8, Night on the Docks. A heavy fog clung to the waterfront, blurring the lines between water and sky. Harrington and Albright moved quietly along a row of abandoned warehouses. Police backup lingered discreetly a block away. Intel suggested Chess's sedan had been spotted entering a deserted parking lot. Harrington's heart thumped as they crept around a corner. Sure enough, Chess's car idled near a chain-link fence, headlights dim. A figure stood beside it. Chess, pacing anxiously, phone pressed to his ear. Just as Harrington prepared to step forward, another silhouette emerged from the fog. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a hooded jacket. The newcomer approached Chess, and a brief argument ensued, inaudible under the sound of lapping water. Suddenly a flash of metal. Chess stumbled back, clutching his abdomen. The hooded figure bolted toward a boat moored at the pier. Harrington sprinted after him, but the assailant dove into the boat and sped off, the roar of an engine echoing across the water. Albright reached Chess first, who was doubled over, blood seeping through his fingers. Harrington radioed for medics. Through ragged gasps, Chess croaked, They don't want the past surfacing. Wolfe, Vance, it's bigger than me." His eyes fluttered and he collapsed. Paramedics arrived moments later, whisking him away. Harrington's frustration mounted. Was Chess going to survive to give a full confession, or would the truth die with him? Back at the precinct, a tense hush settled. Lieutenant Gomez scowled, arms folded. "We've got a potential shadow organization, old mob ties, unsolved murders. This is ballooning, Harrington." He swallowed hard. "I know, but if Chess makes it, we might finally nail who's behind all this." Albright approached, face grim. "Surgeons say he's in critical condition. We won't know if he'll pull through for a while." Harrington left the precinct near dawn, mind racing. A sense of helplessness gnawed at him. He found himself driving toward his father's apartment again. Norman greeted him, already dressed despite the early hour. "I saw the news crawl about the shooting at the docks. You okay?" Miles nodded, shoulders sagging. "Chess got stabbed. The killer escaped. Feels like every time we get close we lose our edge." Norman studied him, expression haunted. "This is how I felt all those years ago, always one step behind. That's when the bottle started calling my name." Silence stretched. Harrington tried to imagine his father as a younger cop, battered by unsolved cases and guilt, their mother at home, trying to maintain normalcy for the kids. He exhaled sharply. I won't fall into that trap, and you won't either. Not anymore. They sat together in the living room, the first light of day illuminating dust motes in the air. Norman reached for an old photo frame, his wife, Miles's mother, smiling on a Coney Island boardwalk, hair wind-tossed. She carried my burdens more than I realized. If she were here, she'd tell you to stay true to your instincts but not let them consume you. Harrington swallowed, fighting a sudden sting behind his eyes. I know. His phone buzzed, shattering the moment. Lieutenant Gomez, clipped voice, Chess is awake, he's asking for you. Harrington shot to his feet, adrenaline pounding. I have to go, Dad. Norman nodded, a gleam of encouragement in his gaze. Go, find the truth. As Harrington headed for the hospital, the city's pulse quickened around him. He couldn't help but feel the weight of legacy, his mother's unwavering support, his father's regrets, an old murder left unsolved. This time, though, he wouldn't let history repeat itself. He'd catch whoever was tying past and present together in bloodshed, no matter how deep he had to dig. Chapter 9. Confessions and Clarity. At the hospital, Harrington found Martin Chess pale and trembling, IV lines snaking from his arms. A uniformed officer stood by the door, but Chess waved him away when Harrington entered. His voice was ragged, but urgent. I didn't pull the trigger on Wolf, he insisted between labored breaths. I was following instructions. Harrington leaned in. Whose? A flicker of terror crossed Chess's eyes. Lydia Harlan at Archon. She gave the orders. She's in deep with an old underworld network that financed Wolf's father decades ago. They've kept the money flowing through shell companies, controlling property deals. Wolf found out and threatened to expose them. Harlan panicked. She told me to handle it, but I couldn't kill him. I just wanted to scare him off. Someone else finished the job. Chess sucked in air, grimacing with pain. I tried to meet her at the docks to settle things, but she sent someone else, the one who stabbed me. Don't let her get away with this. A nurse entered, ushering Harrington out for Chess to rest. Harrington's mind whirled. Lydia Harlan had feigned ignorance, but if Chess's confession was true, she was the spider at the center of the web. She'd orchestrated Wolf's murder to bury secrets tying her to the old Vance case and the mob ties Wolf Sr. had left behind. Racing to the precinct, Harrington briefed Lieutenant Gomez. A warrant was swiftly prepared and a team of officers stormed Archon Investments. Harlan was cornered in her office. Her composure cracked, but she demanded a lawyer, refusing to speak. The forensic accountants had enough circumstantial evidence. Illegal transfers, coded communications, shell corporations. Coupled with Chess's confession, it might be enough to bring murder charges. Harrington watched as Harlan was led away in cuffs, her expensive heels clicking angrily on the marble floor. But a nagging question remained. Who actually pulled the trigger on Grayson Wolf? Harlan didn't match the hooded figure's description. That assassin might still be out there. The press converged outside, hurling questions. Harrington shouldered past them, phone vibrating with congratulatory messages. One from his father simply said, "Proud of you, don't forget the bigger picture." That evening he joined Irene and their father at a diner in East Harlem to decompress. Over plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, they reflected on the whirlwind. "Looks like Harlan's empire is crumbling," Miles said, "but we still don't know who physically killed Wolf." Norman sipped his coffee. "You'll find them. Might be some freelance hitman. Follow the money, see who Harlan hired." Irene smiled tentatively. "At least you've dismantled the bigger operation. That means justice for Wolf and maybe for the Vance family, too, if it's proven these same people were behind that old murder." Harrington nodded. The conversation flowed to lighter topics. His father's physical therapy, Irene's newest outreach program. At one point, Miles realized they hadn't had such a calm, friendly meal together in years. If his mother were watching, he believed she'd be smiling. Later, alone in his Astoria apartment, Harrington stared at a photo of his mother. She had a serene strength in her eyes, a look that said she'd weathered storms but never lost faith. Maybe that was what he needed now. Faith that even if some details remained elusive, they'd done right by the living and the dead. His phone buzzed with a text from Nick Albright. "You up? We might have a lead on the shooter." Harrington allowed himself one last glance at his mother's picture before grabbing his coat. The night was cold, but inside he felt a quiet warmth. This case was nearly closed, and maybe he and his family were starting to mend one step at a time. Chapter 10, New Light. 2 days later, the final piece fell into place. A known hired gun connected to Harlan's network was apprehended in a sting operation near the New Jersey border. Ballistics matched the bullet that killed Grayson Wolfe. The killer confessed he was paid by Lydia Harlan to ensure Wolfe never exposed her dealings. Standing in a Manhattan courtroom corridor, Harrington watched the accused shuffle by in handcuffs. Reporters clamored for statements. Another high-profile case solved. Another measure of justice for the city that seldom rests. After the arraignment, Harrington slipped away. He found his father and Irene waiting outside. The old man leaned on his cane but stood tall, pride evident in his lined face. "You did good, son." A bittersweet feeling coursed through Harrington. "We did," he corrected gently, recalling how Norman's old notes sparked the right questions, recalling how Irene's emotional support gave him clarity. They decided to grab lunch at a nearby cafe. Sunlight streamed onto their table, an unseasonably warm winter day. As they chatted, Harrington brought up their mother again, something he rarely did in casual conversation. "I wish she could see this, us together, figuring things out." Irene's eyes glistened. She'd be happy. She always believed in the three of us. Norman cleared his throat, voice unsteady. "She never stopped believing we could heal. I just wish I'd let go of the bottle sooner." Harrington reached out, covering his father's hand with his own. "She forgave you long before you ever forgave yourself." The moment was tender, raw, and deeply human. It felt like a turning point in their shared history. The city's hum continued outside, indifferent, yet somehow comforting. That evening, Harrington walked Irene home, the crisp air bracing them. On a whim, he asked, "Think I should finally move to a bigger place, one with working lights, maybe near you and Dad?" She laughed. "Only if you promise not to bring your entire murder board with you, but yes, a new start sounds good for all of us." Harrington grinned. As they parted ways, he inhaled the city's air, a mingling of car exhaust, street food, and something else. Hope. The DeLuca case was behind him, the Wolfe murder now solved, and the old Vance secrets laid bare. There would always be another case, another puzzle. But for once he felt he wasn't running from anything. He was running toward a life where family and duty could coexist. Later at his apartment he tidied up. The worn notebook where he jotted personal reflections sat on the coffee table. He flipped it open, scrawling a final note. Case closed. Grayson Wolfe victim. Motive: old skeletons, new greed. Suspects indicted. Justice served. Onward. He added a short line about his mother. "You'd be proud, I hope." Then he closed the notebook, feeling a weight lift. Outside, the glow of the Manhattan skyline beckoned. He stepped to the window, letting the neon haze wash over him. Home was no longer a ghost-laden word. It was here and it was now, forged by second chances and deeper connections. Tomorrow the precinct would call with another crime, another victim needing answers. But for this single moment, Detective Miles Harrington stood still, letting gratitude and remembrance fill the quiet space he'd once feared to enter. End of Chapter 10 and end of story. Thank you for listening. Like and subscribe for more free audiobooks and Miles Harrington mysteries.